Hey there, it's Stephen, and tonight I've got a story that will make you look at mirrors a little differently. Mirrors have always been a little mysterious, haven't they? They're part of our everyday lives, yet they seem to hold a strange power. Most of us glance into them without a second thought. But what if a mirror was more than just a reflection? What if it was a doorway, a trap, or even something alive? Tonight's story is about a college student named Ethan who thought he found the perfect apartment. Affordable, quiet, and close to campus. But he soon discovered that the antique mirror in his living room wasn't just an ordinary piece of furniture. What began as unsettling reflections turned into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Ethan was like any other college student, living on a budget and desperate for a place to stay. When he found a small, cheap apartment close to his university, it seemed perfect. The landlord wasn't much of a talker, but the rent was low, and the place seemed decent enough. Sure, the building was old. The walls were scuffed, the pipes creaked, and there was a faint musty smell in the air. But Ethan didn't mind. He was just glad to have a roof over his head. The first thing that stood out to him was the mirror. It was mounted on the wall in the living room, a massive antique with an ornate frame carved with intricate patterns. At first glance, it looked like a collector's item, something out of place in an apartment like this. But it was too heavy to move, so Ethan left it where it was. At first, life in the apartment was uneventful. Days passed in a blur of classes, studying, and late-night gaming sessions. The mirror was just another part of the apartment, a feature he barely noticed. That all changed about a week in. It was late, well past midnight, and Ethan was dragging himself to bed after a long study session. As he walked past the mirror, something caught his eye. Movement. He stopped, staring into the reflection, but nothing was there. Just his own exhausted face staring back at him, and the dimly lit room behind him. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, he went to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, the movement was clearer. It wasn't just a flicker or a shadow. It was a figure, a faint, shadowy outline lingering in the background of the reflection. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He turned to look behind him, but the room was empty. Over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent. The figure in the mirror didn't just appear, it started to stay. Always in the corner of the reflection, just barely visible. Ethan tried to brush it off. "It's just my imagination," he told himself. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He mentioned it to his friends one day. "You're overthinking it," one of them said. "Probably just a weird angle or the light reflecting off something," another joked. "Maybe it's a ghost. Did you check if someone died there?" Their laughter didn't help. The more Ethan thought about it, the less funny it seemed. The apartment was on the third floor, with no street-facing windows. The curtains were always drawn. There was no reason for any movement in the mirror. Things escalated quickly. The shadow in the reflection became clearer, less like a blur and more like a person. Ethan started noticing it closer to him, standing just behind his reflection. One night, he decided to confront it. He stood directly in front of the mirror, staring into it. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Nothing happened. The room behind him in the reflection looked empty, just as it should. He let out a shaky breath, relieved. But as he turned to walk away, he saw it again. This time, the figure was right behind him in the reflection, standing unnervingly close. Ethan spun around, his heart racing, but the room was empty. He stood there, frozen, afraid to look at the mirror again. That night, he couldn't sleep. The apartment felt wrong. Cold. Heavy. He decided to research the building, hoping to find some logical explanation. What he found only deepened his fear. Years ago, a man had lived in the same apartment. He was a recluse, barely seen by his neighbors. He became obsessed with an antique mirror he had brought into the apartment, spending hours staring into it, talking to it as if it were alive. One day, he vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind was the mirror. Determined to block out whatever was happening, Ethan covered the mirror with a sheet. But every morning, the sheet was on the floor, neatly folded. He even tried moving the mirror, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it were bolted to the wall, or holding itself in place. By now, Ethan was terrified. The reflection was no longer a shadow. It had taken on a form, a pale figure with hollow eyes and a faint, unnatural grin. It wasn't just standing in the background anymore. It was moving, independent of Ethan's actions. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard something. Breathing. It was faint, steady, and impossibly close. He held his breath, listening, but the sound continued. It wasn't coming from his room. It was coming from the mirror. The night before he planned to leave the apartment for good, Ethan woke in the middle of the night. The air was ice cold, and the room was eerily silent. Slowly, he turned toward the mirror. The figure was no longer just a reflection. It was fully visible now, a twisted version of Ethan himself, with sunken eyes and a sickly, pale complexion. It stared at him with a grin that sent shivers down his spine. Before Ethan could move, the figure pressed its hand against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and Ethan felt an invisible force pulling him toward it. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He watched, helpless, as the figure stepped out of the mirror and into the room. The last thing Ethan saw before everything went black was his own reflection, staring back at him from inside the mirror. The next morning, the apartment was silent. Ethan was gone, but the mirror remained. And in its reflection, a pale figure could be seen, watching, waiting. To this day, anyone who moves into that apartment notices something strange about the mirror. No matter where they go, it always seems to be watching. And if you look closely, you might see a shadow lingering behind your reflection, waiting for its chance to escape.